So now we come to what Heidegger's real objective is in this essay, which is to show that the work of art is not merely a representation of some likeness of an actual thing. Rather, the work of art is the happening of being. It is a happening of truth, and genuine works of art disclose the nature of being. Heidegger writes, Van Gogh's painting is the disclosure of what the pair of peasant shoes is in truth. So not merely what the peasant shoes actually look like, but what the peasant's shoes are. And Heidegger introduces another Greek term here to help uncover the notion of truth that he thinks is being disclosed in the work of art. And this conception of truth is the Greek notion of aletheia, the unconcealment of beings. And we'll see that Heidegger doesn't think that this is our standard notion of truth as correspondence, where we have some proposition, that proposition matches or corresponds to the way in which things are out there in the world. Rather, the idea of aletheia is that truth is the unconcealment of a being. In the work of art, the truth of beings has set itself to work. To set means here to bring to stand. Some particular being, a pair of peasant shoes, comes in the work to stand in the light of its being. So remember, Dasein is clearing. The being of beings comes into the steadiness of its shining. So this notion of aletheia for Heidegger is what he's using to describe a disclosure of a particular being, what he calls a happening of truth. So whenever a being is disclosed, Heidegger thinks that this is an event, something which happens in time, and this will eventually allow Heidegger to work out the historicity of truth. Truth is something for Heidegger that happens, and truth for Heidegger is happening in the work of art. And the painting of Van Gogh of the pair of shoes is a way in which the being of the peasant's shoes becomes manifest within the painting itself. That is, the essence of the equipmental quality of the equipment is revealed or disclosed in Van Gogh's painting. And by attending to this particular work of art, we as the viewers are not having some passive experience, but are also participating in the unfolding of this truth. The Van Gogh painting isn't a work of art because it adequately depicts a pair of shoes in drawing a likeness to something actual. Rather, it depicts the thing's essence. And that essence of the thing is something which happens, is a disclosure of being. So we participate in that being as it discloses itself to us. The work, Heidegger will say, opens up a world and rests in the earth. So there is a concealing element, what Heidegger calls the earth in the work of art, but also at the very same time, an opening of a world, a disclosure of being and of meaning. And this is what Heidegger is going to be working out throughout the rest of the essay. The essence of art, Heidegger says, would be this: the truth of beings setting itself to work. Heidegger writes, the artwork opens up in its own way the being of beings. This opening up, i.e., this revealing, i.e., the truth of beings happens in the work. In the artwork, the truth of beings has set itself to work. Art is truth setting itself to work. What is truth itself that it sometimes propitiates as art? What is this setting itself to work? And two examples he gives of truth setting itself to work in the work of art are Holderlin's poem, The Rhine, and C.F. Meyer's poem, Roman Fountain. And I have Meyer's poem here, and I'll just read through it. and let you consider how this might tie into Heidegger's views here. The jet ascends and falling fills the marble basin circling round. This, veiling itself over, spills into a second basin's ground. The second in such plenty lives, its bubbling flood a third invests, and each at once receives and gives, and streams and rests. So what Heidegger is going to do now is explore this notion that the truth happens in a work of art. And the first example that he gives us here is of a Greek temple. And the temple that Heidegger had in mind here, he doesn't specify it in the essay, but Ian Thompson has speculated that it's the Temple of Patsum, the Temple of Poseidon, or Temple of Hera, which was constructed between 460 and 450 BCE. So for what that's worth, we can just take the example of the Greek temple more generically, though, and still get a sense of what Heidegger means here. And Heidegger says that the temple for the historical people opens up a world. It opens up the destiny of the people. The world of the Greeks is opened up in the work. The temple gives a world to a people. And one way of understanding what Heidegger means by this is that the temple isn't some passive object that the Greek person looks upon and appreciates for its craftsmanship or for the beauty that it gives rise to. It is literally a part of their world and defines their own understanding of themselves. The work of art exists within that world and gives meaning to the world. It also, for Heidegger, illuminates what grounds and shelters that historical world, namely what Heidegger has been calling the earth, that out of which the world arises. Heidegger writes, "It illuminates also that on which and in which man bases his dwelling. We call this ground the earth. Earth is that whence the arising brings back and shelters everything that arises as such. In the things that arise, earth occurs essentially as the sheltering agent." So again, if we think back to the example of the pair of shoes by Van Gogh, it's the earth that the usefulness of the shoes is grounded in, its reliability. It's the ground out of which the meaning of the shoes can then arise out of into the world of the peasant woman. Likewise, in the case of the temple itself opens up a world. It opens up the meaning of a historical people. But that world is grounded in the earth, in the reliability of interconnections that the temple exists as a part of, and part of what the temple itself is doing is revealing simultaneously both the ground of the world and the world that arises out of that ground. The temple work standing there opens up a world and at the same time sets this work back again on earth, which itself only emerges as native ground. The temple in standing there first gives to things their look and to men their outlook on themselves. So the temple itself is grounded within this reliability, the interrelated network of meaningful contexts that give rise to the worldhood of the world of the ancient Greeks. The temple itself arises out of that, can't exist independently of it. So the work of art gives rise to a world and at the very same time reveals the ontological foundations of that world. Heidegger writes, "The world worlds, and is more fully in being than the tangible and perceptible realm in which we believe ourselves to be at home. World is never an object that stands before us and can be seen. World is the ever non-objective to which we are subject as long as the paths of birth and death, blessing and curse, keep us transported into being. Wherever those utterly essential decisions of our history are made, are taken up and abandoned by us, go unrecognized and are rediscovered by new inquiry, There the world whirls. So the world is the meaningful context that provides the basis by which we come to understand our world, and that arises in the work. But the world of the work can only arise in the context of the sheltering of that world within the earth. So let's take a moment to try and understand what Heidegger means here by the earth. He writes, in setting up a world, the work sets forth the earth. So what is the earth? The earth is the undisclosed ground out of which the work arises. Remember, it's the sheltering agent. And just as we saw that a being can only reveal itself by, in some sense, keeping itself concealed, so a world can only arise if there is this undisclosed ground out of which it can arise. And the term that Heidegger uses here, the earth, is really interesting. It's interesting in regards to the peasant woman that he thinks those shoes are in the Van Gogh painting. And he's also using it to refer to the kind of material in which the work dwells. So recall back to the thingy nature of the thing, its equipmental nature. That is the material of the work. And in some sense, the actual material of the work is a metaphor for the ontological foundations of the work. There's got to be this network of interrelated contexts which we remain unaware of in order for our particular world to take on the character that it does. There is this grounding of worldhood out of which the particular beings can arise and show themselves as meaningful within that world. So if we think of the stone of the temple, the Greek temple, the stone of the temple can't be used up, can't be penetrated. It is there as a kind of grounding agent. It is the dwelling of the world. The meaning of the Greek world dwells within that temple. And Heidegger thinks that something like the Greek temple, truth happens in that. And that truth in being a happening is historical. So when we look back on the Greek temple from our perspective, the truth has already passed. We can only see the general outline of the truth of that historical people. We can't live it ourselves. So that truth has passed, and Heidegger is interested in whether or not art today can still be a happening of truth. He writes, the earth appears openly cleared as itself only when it is perceived and preserved as that which is essentially undisclosable, that which shrinks from every disclosure and constantly keeps itself closed up. All things of earth and the earth itself as a whole flow together into a reciprocal accord. So again, earth is this sheltering agent, this concealment, which is paradoxically the very ground out of which any being can show itself as meaningful. So as we can see then, the work is not merely a world or not merely the earth. It is a unity of world and earth. Now Heidegger makes it clear that when he says that the work is a unity of world and earth, that is, it is the unity of the self-concealing ground out of which meaningful beings can emerge, that this is not a passive state. This is something which is dynamic and moving. Remember, truth is a happening. It is an occurrence. He says world is self-opening while earth is self-secluding. So they are, in a sense, moving in opposite directions. World is attempting to disclose while earth is attempting to conceal. And Heidegger characterizes this as world and earth being in strife. That is, there is a continual tension between this movement to conceal and this movement to disclose. But it is in strife, in this opposition, that truth happens for Heidegger. So this is why he says the unity of the work is not a passive state. It is a state of tension, and it's that tension and that conflict which allows for the truth to happen in the work of art. He writes, "The opposition of world and earth is strife. In essential strife, rather, the opponents raise each other into the self-assertion of their essential natures." You might think back to the dialectic of Hegel here. The earth cannot dispense with the open region of the world if it itself is to appear as earth in the liberated surge of its self-seclusion. The world, in turn, cannot soar out of the earth's sight if, as the governing breadth and path of all essential destiny, it is to ground itself on something decisive. So world and earth need each other. They are in opposition to each other, and they need each other. It is in this opposition that truth happens in the work of art. So Heidegger gives us a little bit more about what he means by truth here and develops this concept a little bit further. So again, he's introduced the notion of truth as aletheia, the unconcealment of beings. And Heidegger says, well, look, we normally take truth to mean correct representation, truth as correspondence, right? So we have some proposition and it corresponds to the facts. That's normally what we take truth to mean. But Heidegger says there's a more basic mode of truth that underpins truth as correspondence or truth as correct representation. And he says if we think about the words true gold versus sham gold, we'll get a better sense of what we actually mean here by truth. Here, truth means something like genuine or actual, as opposed to correct. And this notion of the unconcealment of beings, that a being reveals itself as authentically what it is, underlies the conception that we have of truth as correct representation. The idea is that in order for a representation, let's say a proposition we have, to correspond to some matter of fact, that matter of fact has to first show itself as it is in order for us to be able to say anything about it. So this notion that the unconcealment of a being underlies the idea of truth as correct representation points to Heidegger for this more basic mode of truth that he calls aletheia, the unconcealment of beings. He writes, with all our correct representations, we would get nowhere. We could not even presuppose that there already is manifest something to which we can conform ourselves unless the unconcealment of beings has already exposed to us, placed us in that cleared realm in which every being stands for us and from which it withdraws. So this notion of truth as a happening underlies our normal conceptions of truth. And this truth as a happening, as aletheia, the unconcealment of beings, is what is happening in the work of art. So as we were talking about in the introduction, Heidegger thinks that Dasein creates a clearing. That is, being creates a space in which beings can show themselves as they are. And this is the idea that Heidegger is getting at here. He says, in the midst of beings as a whole, an open place occurs. There is a clearing. Beings can be as beings only if they stand within and stand out within what is cleared in this clearing. Only this clearing grants and guarantees to us humans a passage to those beings that we ourselves are not, and access to the being that we ourselves are. And yet a being can be concealed as well, only within the sphere of what is cleared. Each being we encounter and which encounters us keeps to this curious opposition of presencing, in that it always withholds itself at the same time in concealment. So for Heidegger, in order for a being to show itself, there has to be an open region in which that being can have light shone upon it. And in order for a being to appear in its light, in its shining, there has to be some element of the being which remains concealed. And Heidegger uses this notion of a clearing in the woods. And we can see from the nice painting here sort of what Heidegger means. There is this open region. You walk into the woods, from out of the woods into this clearing, and you can see all around. But around the perimeter, we see this darkness, this density, and it's that darkness and density out of which the clearing can occur, out of which something can come into the clearing. It's out of this dark background that we are usually not attending to, from which the meaningfulness of our world arises. So Heidegger is saying in the work of art, we have these two elements which are in strife, the earth and the world. The earth is the self-secluding darkness. But we need that self-secluding darkness in the work in order for anything of meaning or intelligibility to arise out of it, a world. So it's those two aspects of the work, the world and the earth, being in strife that gives rise to a happening of truth, a disclosure of being in the work of art. So again, this notion of truth is aletheia, the unconcealment of beings. And now, as we have seen, all unconcealment, all disclosure is conditioned by a kind of negation or a denial. And this is a deeper metaphysical position that Heidegger is adopting, and he explores this idea further in his essay, What is Metaphysics? And the notion here is that for any proposition to count as meaningful, there must be a background of negation or denial by which it can stand forth as some kind of affirmative proposition. So negation or denial is essential to truth. Falsehood is essential to truth. Heidegger writes, concealing denial is intended to denote the opposition in the essence of truth, which subsists between clearing and concealing. It is the opposition of the original strife. The essence of truth is in itself the primal strife in which that open center is one, within which beings stand and from which they set themselves back into themselves. So something can show up as meaningful, as the being that it is, only against a background of darkness, only against a background of concealment. This tension between what is known and what is unknown, what is true and what is false, what is meaningful and what is, in some sense, meaningless, is a necessary struggle in order for anything to appear as it is in itself. Heidegger writes, truth in its essence is untruth. And he's not saying there is no truth. He's saying denial or negation, the concealment of being, is an essential feature of its disclosure. He writes, denial is the provenance of all clearing. So this negation, this darkness, the dark forest onto which the clearing opens, is an essential feature of all intelligibility. This is how truth can also happen in the work of art. The work of art itself provides a self-secluding material out of which a world can arise. Heidegger writes, the work is to be released by the artist to its pure self-subsistence. It is precisely in great art that the artist remains inconsequential as compared with the work, almost like a passageway that destroys itself in the creative process for the work to emerge. So for Heidegger, the work of art has a being of its own. And the nature of that being, if it is a genuine work of art, is a happening of truth. Truth is happening in the work. And so for Heidegger, the disclosure of the being of the work of art is something which is independent of both the artist and the viewer. In some sense, the truth happens in us and in the artist, but the work of art is a being of its own, with its own self-subsistence. The work of art, then, is self-subsistent. It is not some mere product of the subjectivity of the artist. Rather, being is disclosed in the work of art. So for Heidegger, the essence of the creative process is a bringing forth of truth. And recall that a bringing forth of truth is a happening for Heidegger. He writes, the creative process is a bringing forth of beings in that it brings forth what is present as such out of concealment and specifically into the unconcealment of its appearance. To create is to let something emerge as a thing that has been brought forth. The work's becoming a work is a way in which truth becomes and happens. So truth is this opposition of the clearing and concealing. The strife of world and earth that is the work of art brings forth a happening of truth. So the artist is a mere passageway for the work of art, which is, if it's a genuine work of art for Heidegger, a happening of truth. Heidegger writes, but truth does not exist in itself beforehand, somewhere among the stars, only subsequently to descend elsewhere among beings. This is impossible for the reason alone that it is, after all, only the openness of beings that first affords the possibility of somewhere and of sights filled by present beings. Clearing of openness and establishment in the open region belong together. They are the same single essence, the happening of truth. This happening is historical in multiple ways. The establishing of truth in the work is the bringing forth of a being such as never was before and will never come to be again. Creation is such a bringing forth. So truth happens in the work of art. That is to say that the truth of the work of art is something which defines a particular historical epoch in the way that the Greek temple opens up a world for the Greeks. We can look back on that work of art and see the shell of that truth, but we can't occupy that truth as it happened for the Greeks. That's because the truth that happens in the Greek temple is a particular happening in some place and some time. And Heidegger's hope is that maybe we can get out of the subject-object dichotomy, the traditional view of aesthetics where there's some art object out there and it produces maybe pleasant feelings in us or gives us some kind of psychological satisfaction. Rather, Heidegger thinks much more is on the line when it comes to art. Truth and art are intimately connected, and the happening of truth and the work of art can transform a world. So how is this truth then happening in the work of art? To help explain this further, Heidegger introduces this term, the Rift, or der Riss in German. For Heidegger, a rift, or the rift in the work of art, is that strife or tension between world and earth. And it's in this rift, in this strife, that he says a design is opened up, the contours of a meaningful appearance. In the strife of world and earth, concealed and unconcealed, intelligibility and meaning surface against the background of an indistinct self-secluding earth. So he calls this the rift design, and it's as if this tension between world and earth opens up a space in which beings can meaningfully be disclosed. He writes, truth establishes itself as strife within a being that is to be brought forth only in such a way that the strife opens up in this being. That is, the being is itself brought into the rift. The strife that is brought into the rift and thus set back into the earth and thus fixed in place is the figure or Gestalt. So the Gestalt is the figure or the image, and the idea is that in this strife of world and earth, a rift design opens up, the outlines of a possibility of meaning. And it is a genuine possibility that arises out of this strife. It's not a possibility of meaning that we just make up or fancy. It is really there as a possibility. And what the artist does is perceives the outlines of this possible form of intelligibility, and through their skill brings that image, that gestalts that figure, and allows for it to disclose itself as the being that it is. So here's a quote from Ian Thompson's essay in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. To participate in such creation, the artist needs to be receptive to what the origin of the work of art calls the rift design, or fissure, riss, that joins the world to the earth. By creatively and selectively responding to the abundance of ways in which being genuinely offers itself to us, the artist establishes one of these possibilities, bringing it into the light of day for the first time, just as Michelangelo legendarily spent weeks carefully studying the subtle network of veins and fissures running through that famous piece of marble before he could set his David free from the stone. So again, if we think about Earth in the context of Michelangelo, that piece of marble is the Earth, and it is self-concealed, almost incapable of being penetrated. But the artist, in encountering that concealment, finds the genuine possibility of meaning that can arise out of it. And the work of art which is produced is this tension of the darkness of the self-secluding earth and one of the possible forms of intelligibility that can arise therefrom. And the creative process is the process of the artist laying hold on such a possible meaning and allowing for that meaning to show itself, to become what it is and establish a world of meaning and significance. So this is then presumably what Heidegger sees in the pair of shoes from Van Gogh. We see all of this indistinct space surrounding the shoes. And this is the self-secluding earth. This is the concealment out of which some possible form of being can take shape and arise. And this being has its meaning only against this indistinct backdrop. Now, the shoes that Van Gogh has painted, Heidegger thinks of as the shoes of a peasant woman. And so Heidegger says, look, this is very much like how the world of the peasant woman reveals itself to her. Only the abundance of the earth, the self-secluding background of the earth is the dark ground out of which the meaning of the life of the farmer can arise and take shape. So much in the same way, the work of art has this thingy element to it, this self-secluding earth. But it's in that darkness, in that self-seclusion, that some possible form or manifestation of being emerges. And if we take a look, Van Gogh painted a series of paintings of shoes. And so let's just look at a couple of these and see if we can pick up further on Heidegger's theme here. Again, we see the self-concealment of that background. Even the inside of the shoe is dark and concealed, and out of it we begin to faintly perceive a world that arises therefrom. We might not be able to put our fingers on it right away, but we have a sense that these shoes belong to a life that is involved in a network of meaningful relationships, and it's against this backdrop that the shoes can show up as meaningful in this way. So here's another quote from Thompson. When attending to the mysterious nothing allows us to recognize that dynamic tension between earth and world preserved in Van Gogh's painting, then we have thereby encountered what is for Heidegger the inner tension at the heart of art, a tension which not only drives art and keeps it alive, but also allows humanity's understanding of being to unfold historically. Art, in this essential sense, which Heidegger also calls poetry or poiesis, that is, bringing into being, can be understood as an unending creative struggle to express that which conditions and informs our worlds of meaning, and yet resists being exhaustively articulated in terms of these worlds. The conflict preserved in Van Gogh's painting between emerging into the light and receding into the darkness, revealing and withdrawing, emerging and not emerging, is thus for Heidegger the basic structure of intelligibility as it takes place in time. So the work of art is not some passive item to be maybe looked at in a gallery for Heidegger. It is rather a happening of truth, which gives meaning and purpose to a world. It is the meaning and purpose of a world. Art is hidden in nature, and it's drawn out by the work of art. Heidegger quotes here Albrecht Dürer, "For in truth art lies hidden within nature. He who can wrest it from her has it." So for Heidegger, there are these genuine possibilities of meaning concealed within being itself. And we have this tendency to adopt the subject-object view, which we impose our will upon being under this conception of things, and it causes us to miss out on genuine possibilities of being that are there for us to understand. And the artist is one who becomes a conduit for this creative process, for this bringing forth of a happening of truth. Art is a becoming and happening of truth, and the artist is one who enables this to happen. It is a happening that the work accomplishes. Heidegger writes, "There lies hidden in nature a rift design, a measure and a boundary, and, tied to it, a capacity for bringing forth that is art." Art is the capacity to bring forth. But it is equally certain that this art, which is itself hidden in nature, becomes manifest only through the work, because it lies originally in the work. So remember, art is our origin of both the artist and the work of art. And Heidegger's conception of art here is this hidden design within nature itself, but also the possibility of the bringing forth of that meaning, the self-secluding earth, and the world that dwells therein. Now, Heidegger thinks that the essential nature of art generally is poetry. Poetry is the quintessential art language in that it enacts this simultaneous disclosure and concealment. This is not something we're going to explore further right now, but Heidegger thinks that poetry, that all genuine art is in some sense poetry. It is a projective saying. It is a simultaneous concealment and disclosure. Let's close things out here with another quote from Thompson to help us think of the sort of general existential significance of Heidegger's work in the origin of the work of art. So Thompson writes, "Because to make something from what is really there, something which is neither obviously determined by what offers itself to us, nor simply ignores what offers itself to us in order to impose its own subjective idea. This is what all true artistic creation does, according to Heidegger's view. As we saw, every authentic hermeneutics must do this. To interpret any great work of art, you yourself have to struggle to bring forth its hidden riches, just as the farmer must struggle with the earth to bring forth the bounty nurtured within it. To engage in such phenomenological hermeneutics, we might thus say, is to encounter oneself as a farmer of meaning. For such an encounter allows us to understand for ourselves what it is like when the earth comes to inform our worlds with a genuine, partly independent meaning which we ourselves brought forth creatively and yet did not simply make up or project onto the work. When we catch ourselves in the act of making sense of an artwork in this way, then we experience for ourselves that fundamental making sense from which, for Heidegger, all genuine meaning ultimately derives. So, when we interpret a work of art, we are ourselves engaged in this bringing forth. This might even be a work of philosophy that we're reading. When we engage in this genuine encounter with the work of art as a being which discloses itself, we participate in the bringing forth of meaning in our world. And for Heidegger, this is a genuinely postmodern view on art. Truth isn't something that we just project onto things. We don't paste our meanings onto lifeless objects out there in the world. Rather, these works of art are themselves disclosing truth, a genuine possibility of meaning that can show itself to us. And our interpretation of the work of art, or possibly even our creation of the work of art, is our participating in the bringing forth of that meaning in our world.